Hi guys, and welcome to another episode of Atty. Vlogger, Law for the Everyday Layman. Today we take up part 10 on the Law of Obligations and we'll talk about the divisible and indivisible obligations. So if you like my videos and you want to see more, please hit the subscribe button. Also, please remember that this is only for educational purposes and is not a substitute for proper legal advice or for studying and understanding the law. Now, let's take up first the divisible obligations, okay? Divisible obligations are those where the object or prestation is capable of partial performance, meaning it can be performed in parts. Now, the division may be qualitative as to the kind of things, where an example would be where X and Y obligate themselves to deliver a car and a horse. Then X can deliver the car and Y can deliver the horse. Okay? It can also be quantitative, as when X and Y obligate themselves to deliver 100 cubic meters of sand. Okay? And X can deliver 50 cubic meters and Y will deliver 50 cubic meters. Okay? And it can also, the division can also be ideal or only in the minds of the parties, as in the case of a partition of a parcel of land among co-owners, okay? So the division will only exist in their minds because you do not chop up the land, strictly speaking, no? But the partition or division of the land exists only in the minds of the parties as to the metes and bounds, okay? The boundaries of the land, okay? The law also gives us instances when the obligation will be treated as divisible. First is when the object is the execution of a certain number of days of work, such as to paint a house in 10 days. You don't have to paint the whole house in one day. You can divide that obligation into 10 days. And also the accomplishment of work by metrical units, no? As in my example to deliver the sand earlier, you can divide the 100 cubic meters into the two debtors, no? So they deliver 50 cubic meters each. And finally, we have the accomplishment of analogous things, no? Similar things, no? Which by their nature are susceptible of partial performance. As in the case where a debtor is bound to sing 3 songs. Okay? Those 3 songs are separate and the obligation to sing each song may be divided, no? In terms of performance. Okay? So now let's move on to the indivisible obligations. These are obligations where the object or prestation is incapable of partial performance, meaning you cannot perform the prestation in parts, okay? And indivisibility may be legal, provided by law. It can be conventional, as agreed upon by the parties, or it can be natural by nature of the thing, such as to sing one song, you do not sing only the verse, then stop, then sing the chorus, then stop, then the verse again. No. Okay? It's indivisible. Or an obligation to deliver a car. You do not deliver the tires first, then the motor next, then the object of the parties will be defeated. Okay? So, obligations to give definite things and those which are not susceptible of partial performance are indivisible. Okay? They are indivisible obligations. So, what is the test? No? How do I know if an obligation is divisible or indivisible? Okay? You do not look at the possibility or impossibility of partial performance. Do not look at that. The test is the intention of the parties. Okay? So in other words, even if the thing itself can be divided, if the parties had agreed that the delivery or performance shall be incapable of partial performance and must be performed at once, no? As a whole, then the obligation is indivisible, okay? Again, the test is the intention of the parties. Now, I'll give a few rules. If it's a real obligation or an obligation to give, then even if the object or prestation is divisible, then the obligation is indivisible if provided by law or intended by the parties. However, please take note, this is important. If the object itself, the thing is physically indivisible, okay, you cannot chop it up into parts, no, without the essence of the object being destroyed, then the obligation is always indivisible. Again, if the object is physically indivisible, then the obligation will always be indivisible. Okay? Now, I'll give you a presumption to make your lives easier. Okay? An obligation is presumed to be indivisible if there is only one creditor and one debtor. Okay? That's just a presumption. Of course, it's subject to different exceptions under a case-to-case basis. Okay? Now, what about personal obligations or the positive personal obligations to do? No? So we follow the rules I mentioned earlier. If the object is execution of a certain number of days of work, if the accomplishment of work is by metrical units, or if the accomplishment of analogous things which by their nature are susceptible of partial performance, then those are divisible obligations. And finally, when it comes to negative personal obligations, this depends on the character of the prestation in each particular case. Okay? Now, I'll give you an example. No? The obligation not to smoke for 10 years is indivisible. Okay? You cannot stop in between and take a smoke. No? Then the obligation will be violated. No? It will be breached. No? That obligation is necessarily indivisible because you must continue to not smoke for 10 years. But the obligation to sell cigarettes only on Saturday and Sunday is divisible. Okay? Why? Because necessarily there's a break of 5 days in between Saturdays, between Saturday and Sunday to the next Saturday and Sunday. Okay? There's still Monday, Tuesday to Friday, no? So that is the break. So it's divisible as the weeks go by. Okay? Now, a few more rules. These two rules, no, are premised upon the rule that the creditor cannot be compelled to make partial payments. Okay? Why? Actually, I explained this more on in my video on payment, no? The creditor cannot be made to accept partial payments. And second, the debtor cannot be required to make partial payments. Okay? Because performance as a rule must be complete. Must be the whole thing. Again, general rule, creditor cannot be compelled to accept partial payments and the debtor cannot be required to make partial payments. These are the exceptions. First, of course, if the parties expressly agree, no? Second, if there are several prestations and they are set to different periods for fulfillment or they have different conditions, then we follow those, okay? And third, if the obligation is part liquidated and partly unliquidated. If those exceptions are not present, then performance must be complete and the creditor cannot be compelled to accept partial payment and the debtor cannot be required to make partial payments. Okay? Finally, we talk about the joint indivisible obligation, in which case this must be performed by all the debtors, no? If any one of the debtors does not comply, then the obligation is converted to one for damages. Okay? Let's say the obligation was for the debtors to deliver a certain car, and one of those debtors is unable to perform his part, then the obligation is no longer to deliver a car, but is converted to an action for damages. Okay? In other words, the creditor cannot ask for specific performance, no? Why? Because he has no cause of action against the other debtors who are willing to comply. No, it's only that one debtor at fault, no? As for the debtors who are willing to comply, they are only liable for their share. They will not be liable for damages because they're in good faith and they're ready and willing to comply. Okay? So, again, a joint indivisible obligation. When we talk about joint, it talks about the legal tie and the liability of the parties, no? That each party is only liable for his own share. But when we talk about indivisibility, then that talks about the object being incapable of being partially performed. Okay? So in that case, the debtors must all act together and the creditors must all accept or make a demand together. Okay? So that's it, no, for divisible and indivisible obligations. I hope you may have picked up a thing or two, and I hope to see you for my next video on obligations with the penal clause. Okay? See you. Bye.